On August the 8th, 2008, Turkish media reported that the residents of Edirne, near the Bulgarian border, said they spent the last 10 days disturbed by the sightings of what can be best described as a flying man, seen moving from roof to roof at the heights of the minarets. Multiple witnesses over a 2-week period reported seeing the anomalous figure, moving in a manner impossible for a human. For those who personally witnessed the entity, not only were they sure of its physical existence, but some would theorized, given the history of this part of Turkey, the figure was likely a vampire.
There are rumors that amongst the circles of the elite exists a parallel class of people that are not quite human. They are literal vampires. Going back centuries from Vlad the Impaler to modern-day monsters, if what's recorded by both academics and historians from reputable institutions in both folklore and official government reports is even partially true, then there may be at least 120 different species of vampire recorded over history that may be real. Although not all considered as vampires by modern pop culture definitions, classically they include Lilith, originating from ancient Mesopotamia, the Estries of the Levant, the Egyptian deity Sekhmet and its Ka, the Ghoul of southern Arabia, the Dakanavar in Armenia, and the Ubir of Turkey, a country that has become such a historical hotspot for vampire lore. Both Turkey and its enemies had to accept the possibility that these creatures may not only be real, but action would have to be taken against them to protect their populations. For hundreds of years, Middle Eastern and European governments, as recently as the 18th century, enacted laws and launched militarized interventions to deal with the undead. For over 600 years, there are official government documents that detail how large parts of the region were locked in 2 parallel fronts, one between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe, and another where both sides were forced to confront the spread of vampires. For decades, villagers on the outer edges of the empire were increasingly reporting instances of vampirism, forcing Ebusud Effendi, one of the most powerful jurists in Ottoman history, to issue sweeping edicts on not only how these entities were to be confronted, but also on how to handle the humans suspected to have been infected by them while still staying within Islamic jurisprudence. But this is just one of many problems, not only facing the Turkish, the Bulgarians, and even the Austrians hundreds of years ago, because today, in the 21st century, stories persist of vampiric entities hidden in the shadows, secretly living and even feeding amongst us. In the fall of 1833, Governor Ahmet Shukri Efendi penned a letter to the Takvimi Vekayi, the Ottoman Empire's premier official news publication, concerning the manifestation of what was described by residents of the city as a witch or witches. The entity was believed to be responsible for a series of strange phenomena echoing across the city of Turnova, the city which he governed, which is now in modern-day Bulgaria. He wrote that the anomaly, which was causing many families to relocate to other cities, was linked to the appearance of invisible beings that would manifest in people's homes after sunset. These appearances were signaled by what would be classified today as poltergeist-type disturbances, wherein, in the most benign instances, chairs, tables, and other items were mysteriously found broken into pieces, and more terrifyingly on occasion, lifted from their places by an invisible power, where they were hurled with considerable force at people. When the matter was investigated further, residents confirmed that in addition to these happenings, many individuals were also experiencing severe sleep paralysis, a condition that was now impacting many of the city's population. It is here where residents state, and I quote, that the paralysis often felt like a water buffalo sitting on their bodies while in bed. The report goes on to say that the people of the district, wanting to be free of these phenomena, made an agreement for a fee with a person who had become famous at that time for dealing with extraordinary occurrences, a Mr. Nicola Effendi. Upon arriving in the city, he identified 2 graves in its main cemetery that he believed were not normal, with residents confirming that they belonged to 2 notorious Janissary brothers named Terik Oglo, Ali Alamdar, and Abdi Alamdar. Janissaries were members of the empire's Turkish infantry, and Nicola, believing that these 2 were the source of all the anomalous events, sought legal permission from Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire's judicial central, for the 2 men to be exhumed. After the request was granted, the residents were disturbed to find that their cadavers were swollen to nearly double their original size, with hair and nails also continuing to grow. Nicola advised that they should be staked and have their hearts extracted. However, in order to completely rid Turnova of their influence, they should also be incinerated. These men were not merely witches, but something more akin to vampires. This additional request had to be approved by a senior government official, since it is illegal to burn the remains of any Muslim individual after they have passed, due to restrictions underlined in Islamic law. But considering the alleged extraordinary circumstances, permission was granted by Judge Khwaj Sa'd-ad-Din Effendi in Constantinople, after which all anomalous activity within the city immediately ceased. Now it is important to emphasize that as fantastical as all of this sounds, this report is not merely a retelling of an urban legend, folklore, or even a ghost story, but an official statement sent to Istanbul by the governor of Turnova to be published in an 1833 issue of the Takvimi Vakai, which you can see on screen, a government-controlled newspaper, thus officially making it a confirmed government record of 2 vampire slayings. Because of a language barrier, this case is not that well known outside of Turkey, and I personally only discovered it by chance via the Turkish language YouTube channel Gizem Avcısı, that is, The Mystery Hunter. And while he does imply that modern historians view the event as exaggerated, likely a propaganda narrative established to vilify the Janissaries, this case study remains important because it not only confirms that there was already a legal recognition for the existence of these creatures within Ottoman law, but that also a framework was in place distinguishing such entities from regular humans, differences that excluded them from receiving a standard Islamic burial. And as you will see in the next few chapters, it also sets the stage for modern-day encounters with similar vampiric entities, and how regional governments evolved their understanding of the alleged undead as a living threat. Vlad Tepes, or in English, Vlad the Impaler, usually gets dragged into vampire discussions for obvious reasons, but in the Ottoman world, he wasn't a vampire in the same way Turkish lawmakers would eventually classify instances of the undead, but more as a living warlord whose violence was infamous. Mainstream historians correctly note that, as a 15th century enemy of the empire, he used exceptional cruelty as a method to bring fear into his enemies. That matters for vampire lore, because the Balkans were an Ottoman frontier zone where there was already rumors of supernatural vampiric entities existing. However, while mainstream history speaks of Vlad as merely a human with a legacy of brutality, alternative historians suggests he was something darker, a human with ambitions to be more than a mere mortal. The Transylvanian ruler was reputed to drink from the wounds of the young, as he allegedly believed that this would in essence make him immortal. Some believe that this ambition for immortality from one of the 15th century's elite exists among the modern-day elite in equally brutal but less obvious ways, with the rumor that a strain of vampirism among the ruling class exists in industries like the entertainment. In 2005, researchers at UC Berkeley in the US confirmed that sharing hemoglobin can, at least in mice, reverse signs of aging. However, a less messy alternative, a chemical produced by the oxidation of adrenaline and extracted from individuals in their prime via occult practices, has been rumored to be the preferred method of modern-day entities who secretly move among the elite. Whether any of this is true is a topic for another video, but with recent revelations involving powerful individuals and their crimes, and with urban legends about their pursuit for immortality, including the comically over-the-top theory that Jeffrey E. is immortal and once lived as US President Andrew Jackson, we still have to ask, where does urban legend and folklore end and reality begin? Now, when it comes to vampires and the Ottomans, most people point out two key players, Vlad the Impaler, said to be the figure who Dracula was based upon, and then the Austrian government, whose struggle for territory against the Turks accidentally exposed them to Slavic demonology in the most destructive and terrifying way possible. The Austrian victory against Turkish forces at Petrovaradin in 1716, as well as the capture of Belgrade in 1717, had forced the Ottoman Empire to sign the Treaty of Passarowitz in modern-day Serbia in 1718. This gave Austria control over large parts of Serbia for a short period, taking them into new, Slavic-dominated areas and into their first encounters with creatures previously unknown to the Austrians, which accurately fit the description of classical vampires. According to Western historians, the word vampire first appeared around this period in 1725 in Serbia, when an Austrian imperial administrator, Ernst Frumbald, witnessed the exhumation and staking of a deceased figure who had passed away 10 weeks earlier in the Danubian village of Kisiljevo. However, some modern Middle Eastern historians and linguists argue that the term may have older roots, possibly passing between Turkic and Slavic languages centuries earlier, demonstrating that the Ottoman world already had related concepts and vocabulary long before Western Europe became fixated on the vampire idea, a point driven home by the fact that they already had laws in place to deal with the burial of those humans who had turned into the undead, a problem the Austrians were about to experience for the first time. In the years after 1725, especially from 1731 to 1732, the Austrian authorities engaged in formal investigations into the existence of vampires, records of which have been preserved to this day. One report indicates that military personnel were sent to secure the exhumation of suspected vampires to prevent the spread of what officials framed as a kind of contagion, since it was a widely held belief that these vampires were, through a variety of intentional and unintentional means, turning humans into the undead. Troops provided security for the exhumation, staking, and burning of suspected bodies. As part of this wider inquiry, Regimental Surgeon Johann Flückinger led a medical team to places where vampire activity was reported, producing the report that would later circulate widely in Europe. Upon their return to Belgrade, Flückinger wrote an official report to the Belgrade High Command.
After it was reported that in the village of Medveja, the so-called vampires were said to have taken the lives of several persons, I was, by order of High Command, sent there to investigate the matter fully. The present inquiry was conducted, and the oldest Haiduks of the village unanimously state that about 5 years ago, a local Haiduk, by name Arnold Paole, passed away. Within 20 or 30 days after his passing, some people complained that they were being plagued by the said Arnold Paole, and indeed 4 persons were said to have died as a result.
Arnold Paole is an interesting figure because his alleged infection takes us back into Ottoman-controlled territory and into how Ottoman rulership and Islamic law would have to interpret and respond to such claims within the bounds of Sharia, and explain why almost exactly a century later, in 1833, Ottoman jurists, without hesitation, quickly approved the incineration of the Janissary brothers' entities. The last few months of Paole's life were particularly strange and tragic, if his account is to be taken literally. A peasant already living a tough life, Paole had been enlisted into the infantry, where he was assigned to live in an Ottoman-controlled part of Serbia, often described in the sources as Turkish territory, likely around modern-day Kosovo. While there, he claimed he was stalked by a Turkish vampire and eventually bitten by it. So before returning home, Paole took the bizarre action of eating from the earth of the vampire's grave, in addition to smearing himself with its remains, in order to cure himself from any potential infection. Why he would believe this is unclear, but needless to say, it didn't work. In 1727, Paole returned home to the village of Medvedja and becoming one of the most infamous cases of vampirism in history. But not because of the Turkish vampire he alleged he had been dueling with, rather because not long after he returned home, he fell off a hay wagon and died. Well, kinda died. A month or so after his burial, local villagers accused Arnold of troubling them and being responsible for 4 new deaths. This led them to exhume his remains and examine them for signs of vampirism. According to Flukinger's report, the villagers found that Paole was, and I quote, quite complete and undecayed. It was assumed that in his undead state, Paole fed upon local cattle, and given that villagers consumed the same livestock, they were also infected and in danger of transforming. The report states that within 3 months, 17 more individuals perished within 2 and 3 days of a rapidly progressing illness. All of the deceased were exhumed, and while some appeared to have perished due to natural causes, obviously undergoing rigor mortis, many were found in a fresh condition similar to Paole, and thus were assumed to be undead. They, of course, met the same fate as Paole. Now, while the Austrian military case study of exhuming Paole and his fellow villagers is perhaps the most famous amongst Westerners, as it's been covered on YouTube, blogs, and articles numerous times, it was just one small chapter in a larger series of anomalous events that featured way more bizarre variants of your classic vampires, many of which have been recorded and kept in official historical records. Nearly 200 years earlier, Ottoman administrators were already struggling to comprehend the unprecedented nature of the undead as a real and present threat that had the potential to destabilize the parts of the Ottoman Empire that extended into Slavic territories and other Central and Eastern Europe-based colonies. As mentioned in the Cold Open, Ebesut Effendi, one of the most famous and powerful Ottoman jurists of all time, issued a series of edicts not only on how to fight vampires, but also on how to deal with humans who had either been infected or had lost their lives to these entities, following reports of entire villages succumbing to attacks by these creatures. Initially dismissing such stories as most likely European fairy tales, or, at most, an anomalous threat that had little to do with Islamic Ottoman peoples, as more and more predominantly Muslim villages began reporting vampire encounters, Effendi was forced to implement a number of rulings that residents were required to follow upon encountering the undead. Whether or not Effendi actually believed in the existence of vampires is irrelevant, because his primary concern was the maintenance of societal harmony. Harmony that neither succumbed to hysteria nor contradicted the empire's Sharia-based law, at a time when villagers were now exhuming suspected infected bodies from their graves and burning them. Up until the 1500s, Constantinople, the heart of the empire, generally treated vampire lore in the way empires tend to treat frontier superstition, as someone else's problem, and usually a Christian one. But as reports spread, and as frightened villagers started taking matters into their own hands, the problem stopped being folklore and became a governance issue. Because under Islamic rites, when a Muslim passes away, the body is meant to be washed, shrouded, and buried as soon as possible, and then left unharmed. That principle is not a flexible one, and it certainly isn't designed for communities that have started digging up graves at night. So, when villagers began burning the deceased, the most extreme violation imaginable in this context, Effendi's legal posture shifted into something very specific, creating a state-sanctioned framework that prevented mass panic from turning into mass desecration. His tenure as Sheikh al-Islam ran for 30 years, and what's striking is how early the imperial center is already being forced to respond to the undead question as a legitimate security threat. In the best-cited scholarship discussing these texts, Effendi doesn't write like vampires are real. He treats the claim as possible in the only way a jurist of his position can safely frame it, that being, if this is happening, then it happens only by God's will, and it may be understood as something like wicked spirits attaching to corpses, like a ghoul, a phenomenon still confined inside a theological worldview. According to Dr. Emre Öktem, Associate Professor of International Law at Galatasaray University, Istanbul, Effendi stated that in signs of vampirism in a deceased non-Muslim, the entity should first be staked, and if the evil spirit persists, he must then have his head removed and placed next to his feet. If, however, the anomalous effects of the entity are still being experienced by the villagers, he has to be unburied and burnt. This Islamic approach to dealing with vampires wasn't formally codified in a single moment, but by the late 17th century, we can see it clearly taking shape in practice, decades before the Austrians began to document similar cases, culminating in Flückinger's infamous 1732 report. However, Effendi's rulings were still open to criticism by the 18th century Ottoman lawmakers. A landmark case from this period, centered in the Edirne region, shows how his legal logic was challenged, albeit mildly. Around the late 1600s or early 1700s, a suspected reanimated individual named Beyikli Ali became the focus of concern, where villagers claimed they were seeing signs of what they say in Turkish, and forgive my pronunciation, erva-ı habise, or demonic spirits, was manifesting around his grave. So basically, a variety of supernatural phenomena suspected to be tied to one or more deceased individual, like in our Janissary case that happened decades later. After residents complained about the alleged anomalous manifestations, Edirne's ruling administrator was skeptical of the then current procedures created by Ebu Suud Effendi many decades earlier, because he reasoned they were not procedural enough for his modern era, the 1700s. According to him, while Effendi's logic was sound, particularly where he states that if this vampire phenomenon is real, by God's will, and if it's causing harm, only then extreme intervention can be justified. However, the ruling administrator seemingly had a problem with this introductory approach to the undead, especially since up until then, all subsequent laws for investigating vampirism was based on them. It was simply too ambiguous. Who decides it's real? What counts as harm? Who authorizes exhumation? What method is allowed? When does it cross into desecration? His questions reflected how serious the government took the vampire problem, and instead of acting immediately, he referred the matter upward to the Ottomans' highest courts, eventually transforming Effendi's ritualized rule for dealing with anomalies into a controlled, state-mediated process, subject to strict rules, guidelines, checks, and procedures, all subject to government permission. This clinical approach to vampirism within the empire was not restricted to government reports, rules, and regulations, but also in the works of other highly esteemed writers and historians. For example, famed Turkish travel writer Evliya Çelebi, writing in the 1600s, describes community encounters with these beings in a practical, procedural way. He says families would pay identifiers, essentially local vampire hunters, to determine whom was believed to be leaving the grave at night. They would inspect the soil for disturbance, exhume the body, and interpret certain physical signs as proof, including eyes described as cups full of blood and a face that appeared reddened. Once identified, the response he records is direct: a wooden stake driven into the body, and in some cases the corpse is burned, because people feared the phenomenon could recur. He also records a separate, more unusual episode in the Caucasus involving Ubirs, which he describes as sorcerer-type figures, and he dates it precisely to 20 Cheval 1076, corresponding to April 24th or 25th, 1666. In Evliya Çelebi's work Seyahatname, in a passage set in the Ubir Mountains between Circassia and Abkhazia, he describes a nighttime clash that lasts until dawn, and he explicitly says these beings were seen moving through the air. And according to the academic Kemal Kafadar, a professor of Turkish studies, the word Ubir, when applied to the Turkish language of that time, means to siphon liquid. As this is something vampires do to humans, he states that this is Evliya Çelebi describing the mechanics these entities use to claim their victims. Kemal goes on to even state that, through this Turkish etymology, our modern term vampire derives, although that is a debated hypothesis. Regardless, these travelogues were not fairy tales but legitimate threats, despite how some modern literary historians in the 21st century reframe his travelogues as examples of magical realism. And in case you are wondering, are we even still talking about vampires at this point? As many of the creatures that, at least according to popular Western culture, don't come under the category of vampire? Well, yes, we are. As mentioned already, the undead within Eastern cultures does not follow the strictly defined categories you will see put forward in popular entertainment today. And most concerningly, creatures like Ubors, or Upur, are important here because at least one such entity may have manifested over the skies of Edirne as recently as 2008.
On August 8, 2008, Turkish media reported that the residents of Edirne, specifically in districts of Ghazmihal and Menziliher near the Bulgarian border, said they spent the last 10 days disturbed by the sightings of what can be best described as a flying man, seen moving from roof to roof at the heights of the minarets. Multiple witnesses over a 2-week period reported seeing the anomalous figure, moving in a manner impossible for a human. Officials dismissed it, and even Edirne's acting mufti, Irfan Ustangdag, reportedly described it as a collective hallucination magnified by superstition.
Upon the rumors of a flying man, which has been circulating in the Ghazmihal and Menzilahir neighborhoods for a while, the residents of the neighborhood had a mevlit read, a significant religious ritual involving special prayers, hymns, and poems. After rumors of its existence spread by word of mouth, the Edirne Roman Association oversaw a gathering that was held on Ağaç Pazarı Street to calm the population's fear, despite Edirne's senior religious figures dismissing the sightings of this creature as nothing more than superstition.
However, for those who personally witnessed the entity, not only were they sure of its physical existence, but some would theorize, given the history of this part of Turkey, the figure was likely a vampire, and as it would later seem, the first of several that would reach the Turkey's mainstream media, in instances that were significantly more gruesome than merely a flying man.
Seyirciler, sırada inanılması zor bir olayın haberi var. Vampirleri biz sadece filmlerden bilirdik ama gerçeğinin de olduğu ortaya çıktı, hem de Türkiye'de. Dünya tıp literatürüne geçen ilk vampir Denizli'de yaşıyor. Arkadaşımız Yavuz Oymak, yerli vampirin doktoruyla konuştu.
In 2013, the family and friends of a 23-year-old Turkish man were growing increasingly disturbed by acts of the harm he was inflicting upon himself. Over a 2-year period, what began with small injuries quickly escalated into more serious actions that included autohemophagia, more commonly known as auto-vampirism, as he would drink from his own wounds. But this was just one aspect of an extremely disturbing nightmare. The individual who soon came under the care of Turkish doctors was diagnosed with a multiple personality disorder after he claimed he was experiencing memory gaps at more regular intervals, daily finding himself in places he had no idea how he reached. But according to the accounts of people in his neighborhood, this was not merely a case of schizophrenia, but something more sinister. In addition to suffering numerous bouts of missing time, the man had been seen talking to himself, claiming to friends that he was being tormented by an invisible companion, who he would later explain to the doctors as an entity that forced him to carry out violent acts, not just against himself, but also others. And it wasn't violence for the sake of violence. He described an addiction to hemoglobin and a need to consume it to survive, describing his thirst as urgent as breathing. We will explore what this entity could possibly be later on in the episode. Just know for now that its behavior closely matches what we in Islam call al-Qareen, a constant companion that attaches itself to a human from birth and, according to ancient Egyptian lore, has a similar thirst. According to local doctors, his cravings became so pronounced that he even recruited his father to obtain packets for him from a local blood bank. The man, whose name and hometown were not revealed, was described in a report published in the Journal of Psychotherapy and Psychosomatics by doctors from Denizli Military Hospital in southwestern Turkey, and was presented as the first patient they had encountered as officially suffering from vampirism. Now, because of platform guidelines, this has to be heavily redacted, but you may want to skip ahead about 30 seconds regardless if you are a little squeamish. The individual had begun exhibiting the initial stages of the affliction after his 4-month-old daughter became ill and died, followed by witnessing the murder of his uncle and seeing another violent kill in which one of his friends cut off the and penis, according to the journal. Although doctors claimed that he was eventually cured, a similar instance of vampirism emerged nearly a decade later in 2021, where in Istanbul, a 19-year-old was undergoing treatment for developing an identical, insatiable thirst. Like the earlier case study, this young man had experienced trauma in his life, albeit less destructive. According to news articles, years earlier, his unusual hunger began after a friend of his injured himself, where he somehow tasted his wound. Later, when he was an intern at a hospital, he'd steal tubes that had patient samples, drinking from them. When his family finally learned of the horror, they got him some help. Now, while these two cases of confirmed vampirism suggest a psychological problem, at least for this 19-year-old, this unhealthy appetite has been around for centuries, the modern and Ottoman eras, manifesting in ways that not only speak of humans, both living and dead, who thirst for this, but other beings that are beyond human. As mentioned in the preview, when compiled all together, globally and across multiple folklores and cultures, there are approximately 120 species of vampires, give or take, our modern understanding of the creatures influenced by Hollywood. These include entities that are essentially revenants, blood drinkers, life force thieves, night hags, and undead sorcerers, hence why Turkish historians classify creatures like the Janissary brothers as vampires. And when you group them into archetypes, it collapses to roughly 10 to 20 core categories. The origins of real-life vampire cases can be traced back to ancient civilizations such as the Sumerians and Babylonians. According to some historians, the first reports of vampire-like creatures came out of the Persian Empire. Around the same wider region, the ancient cultures of Babylonia and Assyria had legends of a being called Lilitu, often connected to Lilith in Hebrew mythology, a demon said to sustain itself on newborns. These echo later stories of female shape-shifting demons who lurked around villages at night, such as the Estri. Meanwhile, in ancient Egyptian lore, the story of the Egyptian deity Sekhmet and the Ka was known to target adults in a similar way. What's particularly interesting about the Ka is that it's described as a spiritual double of an individual, existing as an independent being, and continues to do so even after its human passes. Potentially a cross-pollination of beliefs between the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Arabs, its description is strikingly similar to an Islamic understanding of the al-Qareen, where every human is assigned one from birth, with our 2013 vampire case study being a theoretical example of a particularly aggressive one. Now, according to Islam, as a jinn-type species, not all of these entities are evil, some are inert, and for the lucky few, some are beneficial. However, in Egyptian mythology, it is said that these beings can become a threat to others after their assigned human passes away. If the Ka is not provided with adequate offerings, it's said to leave the tomb and feast on other humans to sustain itself, so in essence, becoming vampire-like. But now, going back to Turkey and Central and Eastern Europe, the earliest traces of vampiric creatures in Armenian tradition date back to 300 AD. During this period, Armenian cosmology was populated by malevolent spirits known as Dev and Vishap, dragons and demons capable of taking human form and feeding on the life energy of the living. Vishap creatures are cosmic entities, completely Lovecraftian in scale, and according to lore, their hunger is so intense that if unsatiated, the entity can eventually consume the entire planet. One of my channel's earliest episodes covers several detailed, government-filed documented encounters spanning from the Ottoman Era to the 1990s of such a creature in Turkey's Lake Van. To watch that episode, go to the link in the description box below. Anyway, in Armenian folklore, one of the earliest figures associated with vampirism is the Alk, a malevolent spirit that primarily posed a threat to pregnant women, and again, newborns. According to folk traditions, the Alk could assume a number of various forms, from a handsome man to an animal, sustaining itself with the blood and breath of its prey. Historians note that with the adoption of Christianity as the state religion under King Tiridates III, many of these older pagan beliefs were reinterpreted through a Christian lens, where vampires were now framed as demons or fallen angels. Likewise, as you can see from this episode, an Islamic interpretation would frame them as jinn. But whatever the case may be, they were, and possibly are, a class of intelligent life that when in physical form is extremely aggressive, and may have existed among us for thousands, maybe millions of years in the shadows, at least according to folklore. So, in conclusion, are vampires real or not? Often, this channel will take a neutral view on the anomalous events and entities chronicled, showing multiple perspectives on what any given phenomena could really be. However, the case for the existence of these beings seems almost concrete and difficult to deny, especially when archaeologists still unearth till this day graves where it seems the deceased may have been staked. And if indeed these creatures are real, where are they today? Since this is now essentially a history and lore channel, it's rare you will ever see videos of grainy pictures of alleged anomalies and entities recorded on a potato as evidence. For now, that's what it's not about. But what this channel will continue to do, insha'Allah, is to examine and present historical and modern records and testimonies of high strangeness. Anyway, given the allegations of what certain individuals who roam amongst the elite are into, including the consumption of blood amongst other grotesque acts, maybe it's true that variants of these creatures live on in positions of influence. Historically, what's striking isn't just that different societies described different vampires. It's that across centuries, different government institutions kept circling the same phenomenon, but labeling it in whatever language their era and culture could tolerate. When the Habsburg authorities document these cases, it's treated like a kind of contagion, something that has to be investigated and contained. Likewise, in the Ottoman record, in addition to taking this methodological approach, it's not just viewed as a dangerous frontier folklore belief that can destabilize a community. It's treated as theologically possible in the sense that if something anomalous is happening, it can only happen by the permission of God, since the Ottoman Empire is theologically based on Islam. So while the labels, paperwork, and institutions change, the core story remains the same. People keep reporting on humans behaving in a variety of inhuman ways that sometimes crosses into the impossible, with one constant in each example, an insatiable relationship with blood. But what do you think? Do you believe in the existence of vampires? And do you believe government authorities, even in the modern age, consider it more than just a psychological threat? And if these creatures are real, exactly what are they? Spiritual, evolutionary, or something completely beyond our understanding? Sound off with your opinions in the comments. Do all the usual YouTube things like liking, subscribing, and the checking that notification settings are still on. Follow me on X, Insta, and pledge your support on Patreon if you can. Links in the description. And inshallah, we will see you in the next one.